All right, we are here today. It's March 27th, 2013. We are in the Archives Research Room at the Military Museums. We are interviewing John Osborne, a medic in the Korean War. Karen Cooner is one of the interviewers, and James Baldwin is one of the interviewers. So the first question we're going to start you off with is, could you provide us with your full name?
My name is John Osborne, and I live at 323 Rundle Hill Drive, Northeast Calgary, and I've been there for just about 40 years.
Okay. So where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Bebington, England, and came over to Canada in 1947 on the Aquitania on the 20th of November with my family, and there was 11 of us who came, and we took up farming in Saskatchewan, Truax, Saskatchewan.
So is that where you would have gone to school, in Saskatchewan?
I went to school in Regina for a while, till we moved out to the farm. Then I went to school in Truax, Saskatchewan.
So how did you become involved in the military?
Well, we sold the farm around about 1951, and we moved back to Regina. And of course I was in grade 8 at that time, and I played hooky from school one day, and my friend and I said, why don't we go and join the army? So off we went, and I made it and he didn't.
So, and how old are you?
Well, I did lie about my age. I was 16 at the time.
So,
How did your family feel about that?
It didn't really matter to them. If that's what you want to do, son, you go ahead and do it, because most of my uncles, I had 7 uncles, and they were all in the Second World War, so, you know. And I lived through the bombing and everything while I lived in England, so we were bombed out of my home 5 times, and I lost 5 friends, so, you know, it was just life at that time.
So where did you do your training then? Your military training?
Well, when I first joined up, I wanted to be in the medical corps, but they put me in the artillery. And I think I was in the artillery for about a month, maybe a few days. And we were on a shoot at Work Point Barracks. And one of the fellows got his hand caught in a breach, and I administered first aid to him. So shortly thereafter, the RSM came along and said, Osborne, the commanding officer wants to see you, and if you've disgraced us in any way, you're in big trouble. So I went in all the time, the commanding officer knowing, or the RSM knowing while I'm going to see the commanding officer. So when I got in there, he said, I understand you gave medical aid to Gunner so-and-so, and I said, that's right, sir. He said, well, the doctor wants to thank the medic for saving the man's hand. He says, I understand that you want to be in the medical corps. So I said, yes, sir, that was what when I joined up, that's what I wanted to be. He says, pack your bags, lad, you're leaving this afternoon. And I went to Camp Borden and took my medical training, not in Camp Borden. I took my training in Charlie Park in Toronto.
And how long would that have training been?
That would have been a 6-week course at that time.
Are you assigned to a unit right then? Or?
No, it's like a school, only you're sent from Camp Borden, because that's where the training took part at that time, was in the it was a hospital, Charlie Park Hospital in Toronto. It was a military hospital. So after I finished that, then I was sent back to Camp Borden and attached to the 37 Field Ambulance. So, and then the next thing we know, we're told we're going to Korea, and we asked them, where the hell was that? Because we had no idea where Korea was, none.
So had you heard anything about the North Koreans in the sense of, did they have an impression? Did this Did your fellow soldiers have any idea about who the North Koreans were or anything like that?
At that time, on our way to Korea, like I said, we didn't even know where Korea was. So who was a North Korean, who was a South Korean? We had no idea, none whatsoever, till we got there. And then we realized, we all realized that we weren't fighting the North Koreans, or the infantry would. I wasn't fighting anybody. But the infantry, the PPCLIs and the RCRs and the Van Doos, they were fighting Chinese. They weren't fighting North Koreans anymore. North Koreans were, by the time I got there in 52, they were basically obliterated. So, and that was it. They realized that China was involved in that war. So,
do you recall how you traveled to Korea?
By boat. I'll never forget it. I was so glad to see land, I kissed it. I wanted off that boat so bad. I think it took us around about 11 to 12 days to get there. And I think out of the 11 to 12 days that we were on board, I think I was sick for 7 of them. So it was a pretty rough trip, troop ship. So.
Did you go straight to Korea or did you stop in Japan?
Oh, we went straight. Oh, well, yes, we did stop in Japan. The boat was docked in Yokohama, and the RCRs were on board with us, and the Van Doos were on board, and I believe some PPCLI, and of course Service Corps, Medical Corps, Dental Corps, pretty well everybody. And some of the infantry officers let the men go for the day, but our commanding officer wouldn't let us go. Colonel Caswell, said, no, everybody stays on board. So some of us jumped ship in Yokohama and went over the side, down the ropes, and went out and had a party.
So did you have any impressions of Japan? Like, was there war damage?
All we thought was the beer was cheap and everything was just great, because things were cheap at that time.
Oh, to be 16 again.
And finally, after we'd been out there for the evening, and I forget how long we were out there, we were rounded up by military police, whether it be U.S. police, Canadian police, or Australian, New Zealand. It didn't matter who picked us up. We got picked up by British police, we called them red caps, and they took us back to the ship, and we walked up the gangplank, and the man in charge at that time, he says, there's some more for the brig, and he says, there's no point in putting them in the brig, sir, it's full. And the brig is the jail on board ship. So we didn't end up in the brig. We were just told we will see our commanding officer the next day. And after the ship pulled out of Yokohama, the captain had us all brought up on deck, everybody. And he said, for those who deserted my ship, I want you to know that I could sentence you to life in prison. However, because you deserted the ship in a foreign port. So he told us that he was going to let each commanding officer deal with us. So in our particular case, we were all lined up in the hallway, or alleyways, if you want to forget what they call them on board ship. But our commanding officer, Colonel Caswell, was dealing with us. So after a few fellows went in, we said, what's he asking? He said, he wants to know how much money you spent downtown in Yokohama. Oh. So when I got in front of him, he said, how much did you spend, Osborne? I said, $15, sir. He says, you're a liar. $50 fine. March us out. So at that time, we had a clerk by the name of Ross Myers, who was my very good friend and had been for over 60 years, and he just passed away last year. And he was the one that used to cut the Part 2 order showing how much you got fined. Well, I guess after 60 years I can tell you that that part to water was never cut, because he was one of the ones that got fined as well. So, so that's, and then of course we headed off to Korea, and we got to Korea, and at that time, we didn't dock right in a harbor because we couldn't. The ships were, I'd say, maybe a mile offshore, approximately, give or take. And we went over the side of the ship into landing barges. But we could smell that island before we ever got there. It was just unreal. And it was due to the fact that Busan, they call it Busan now, but it was all burnt to the ground at that time. And of course the stench of coming off that island, because there was lots of people got burnt in that fire. So we could really smell the island before we ever got there. And then of course we were all boarded onto trains, and away we went off into South Korea, and we ended up at I ended up with the unit at 37 Field Ambulance. We relieved 25 Field Ambulance. They came home, we took over.
So one of the questions I had was, so are you issued, as a medic, what types of things are you issued for equipment, and are you issued weapons too, or how would that work?
When we first got there, we had our 303 rifle, and you carried that everywhere you went, except if you were in a medical unit. You didn't carry, you had to carry it from your tent to the medical treatment room, but once you got there, you could put it down, type of thing. So we had that rifle, and then I was only with the field ambulance for around about a month and a little bit, because when you were off duty, time was your own. So I went down to a British unit and had a few beer and got myself drunk. And in the meantime, some of my other friends had stolen a half-track, and it ended up in a minefield. And one of the fellows got injured. And the military police knew that it was medics that stole the half-track. There was no question about that. So our commanding officer, Colonel Caswell, and the RSM got together and did a bed check. And anyone that wasn't in the bed, they were absent without leave. So the next morning, we were up on what we called orders parade. And there was 22 of us on orders parade. And I was the first one in, along with my good friend, Ross Myers. When we got in there, the commanding officer dealt with me first. And he said, Private Osborne, he said, look at your crime sheet. He said, you've only been in the Army a couple of months or so, he said, and your crime sheet is worse than Al Capone. And I said, but sir, I said, I've never been on charge. He said, you've got everything from rape to murder on here, he said. I said, sir, that's not my crime sheet. He says, you're Private Osborne, SL4011. I said, yes, sir, that's me. He said, well, I'm telling you, you've got a disgusting crime sheet for the time you've spent in the military. Again, I said, sir, that is not my crime sheet. Are you calling me a liar, Private? I said, if you want to put it that way, sir, yes, sir, I'm calling you a liar. He said, 14 days, Sergeant Major, march him out. And I went down to Seoul Detention Barracks for 14 days. And while I was in detention, I met Second World War veterans who said, oh my God, that happened to you? I said, yeah, it did. He said, well, when you get back to unit, he says, ask for redress of a grievance. And like I said, I just turned 17, I didn't know, what they were talking about, but they were Second World War veterans. They must have known something. So when I got back to my unit, I did ask the adjutant for a redress of a grievance, and Major Anderson took out my crime sheet, and the only thing that was on my crime sheet was 14 days detention. He said, who did you go up with when you were charged? I said, Ross Myers. So he pulled out Ross Myers' crime sheet, and he said, oh, I see where the mistake was made. Okay, the CO was looking at Ross's crime sheet and me. So he said, you do have grounds for redress. But he said, he said, you've only been in career for a short while, he said, and you've still got a whole year to go. He said, the commanding Colonel Caswell could get you somewhere along the line. He said, I'm not threatening you, but he said, I'm just telling you the facts of life. However, he said, if you don't want to go ahead with a redress, he says, I'll post you out to the unit immediately. He says, if that's what you would like to do. I said, yes, sir. The last I want to see of Colonel Caswell would be a pleasure. So he posted me out to the, what they call the casualty clearing post, which is approximately 3/4 of a mile behind the enemy lines. And I spent 6 months there. So.
Could you explain some of your roles at the casualty clearing station, what you did there?
Well, when I first got there, Captain Gallopy was the medical officer, and Joe Quinn was the sergeant. And they said, we've read your record and a little note from Major Anderson at the field ambulance, and we hope you're going to come here and cause no trouble. And I said, you won't get any trouble out of me. So I proceeded to do my job that was detailed to me, and that was if the medical officer wanted something, I did it, and if Sergeant Quinn wanted something, I did it. And we proceeded to look after wounded when they came in, whether they came in by helicopter, ambulance, or whether they were brought down by jeep ambulance from what we call the battalion aid station. And the casualty clearing post covered all 3 battalions, PPCLI, RCRs, and Bandoos. But our mainstream of casualties that came in were from the RCRs, because they were closer. But we had quite a few. As a matter of fact, one of the first duties that Sergeant Joe Quinn gave me was they need an ambulance to go up to the aid station and pick up some casualties. So get yourself a driver and away you go. And I said, well, where do we go? He said, don't worry about it. The driver knows where to go. So it was called the bowling alley. And it was called the bowling alley for a very good reason. And my driver, at that time, and I didn't know him from Adam, we proceeded to go down the bowling alley. And Jerry, I cannot remember Jerry's last name for the life of me, but Jerry would run out 100 yards or 200 yards down the bowling alley, and he would stop. And he would go 1,000, 2,000, and away he'd go again. Anyway, that was my first trip, and coming back, he did the same thing. So after we got back, I said to Jerry, I said, what was this business of stopping 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 and running off for another 100 yards and doing the same thing? He says, I used to be a mortarman in the artillery. So the mortars, you could hear the poof. And Jerry would count 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and he'd take off, because as soon as he took off, the bomb would land right where the ambulance that we were driving in would land. And the Koreans, or Chinese, were very good at it. Okay. So from then on, anytime I had to go down the bowling alley, there was only one person I went with, and I took many trips down that bowling alley in 6 months. The only person I ever went with was Jerry. I would not go with anyone else. So, and as far as casualties go, we had all kinds of casualties. We had burnt casualties, people with arms missing, legs missing, chest wounds, and sometimes the battalion aide would take an ambulance if they weren't too busy, and they would bring the deceased down to us, and it was up to us to collect those deceased and eventually get them into a truck and move down to Seoul, where they were taken care of. So we had quite a time at the CCP, and it was very good. As a matter of fact, when I first got there, all we had basically was call them dugouts if you want, and a tent. And what the other men were trying to do, along with the Captain Gallopy and Joe Quinn, was build what they called a bunker, which is built of sandbags. And one day we had a sergeant come down from the RCRs, and that was the first time that I had ever seen a man with a beard in the Army. And I thought, geez, I have to shave every day. So I asked the sergeant, I said, how come you've got a beard? And I said, I have to shave every day. He says, well, I belong to the Pioneer Platoon. And I said, what is a Pioneer Platoon? So he briefly explained to me what a Pioneer Platoon was. So he said, you guys are really having trouble here. What are you trying to do? I said, we're trying to build a bunker. And that time, Sergeant Quinn was right there, and he said, yeah, he said, we'll get it built someday. And the sergeant said, from the Pioneer Platoon, he said, Sergeant, he said, I'll be back tomorrow. Oh, okay. Well, we'll see the doctor again? No, I'll be back. So doesn't he bring back about 10 men? And they're Pioneer Platoon. And that's what they do, is build bunkers. And they built a bunker like you wouldn't believe. It was like the Taj Mahal by the time they got finished. We had a medical treatment room. We had a place to hold our patients while, if it was raining or whatever. And it was, boy, talk about comfort. It was just great. And they also built some bunkers for men to live in. Okay. So while we were there, of course, I don't know whether you've ever heard of hemorrhagic fever. Well, we had quite some patients coming in with fevers, and of course they were evacuated almost immediately because we had no way really of treating them. So we would send them down to Seoul, and they would ship them off to Japan or whatever. And one day, we just finished about a 72-hour go. We just never stopped. If you slept, it was like what we call a power nap. You took 5 or 10 minutes and put your head on a stretcher for a minute, and somebody would wake up and say, "Come, we've got more casualties coming in." So we were going pretty steady. Anyway, finally, after it was all ended, the Captain Gallipher broke us into 2 sections and said, okay, you guys can go to bed, you guys have to stay up. Okay, so we kind of alternated. So Sergeant Quinn, on the first shift, he went to bed. And eventually, Captain Gallipher said, I need Sergeant Quinn. So my friend, who now lives in, he moved to BC, he used to live here. He moved to BC. His name's George Stagg. And they sent George over to get the sergeant. And he came back and he says, I can't wake him. So Captain says, oh, okay. Let him sleep for a while. What the heck, nothing's happening. So I don't know, an hour later or so, he said to me, he said, go and get Sergeant Quinn. So I went over to get Sergeant Quinn, and I couldn't wake him either. But the difference between George and myself is I was what they called a Group 2 medic, so I was more experienced than George was. And I checked him, and I said, geez, he doesn't, there's something wrong here, okay? So I went back to Captain Gallopy, and I said, I can't wake him, sir, but I said, there's something wrong with Sergeant Quinn. So Captain Gallopy grabbed his stethoscope, and away we go over to Sergeant Quinn's bunker. Well, try and make a long story short, he said, get some men, he said, get him on a stretcher and get him out of here right now. So we got him out. So there was more light where the captain could see him. He said, phone for a helicopter. So we phoned for a helicopter. And Sergeant Quinn was put on the whatever diagnosis Captain Gallopy came up with at that time. I really can't remember, and I didn't find out till many years later, that Sergeant Quinn had hemorrhagic fever, and he was almost dying on us. So, like I said, I was the last, myself and Captain Gallopy, and I think George Stagg was involved. We loaded Sergeant Quinn on a helicopter, and away he went. We never saw him again. So, I think it was shortly after that I was posted down to what they call the 25 FDS, field dressing station. And the CO there was Colonel Darby. And to say the least, unfortunately, he's passed away now, but he was a gentleman of gentlemen. He was a surgeon. He was not a soldier. He was a surgeon, and he was I would say, one of the best surgeons I've ever seen. He was fantastic. He was about 6'2". He had a hand that would make two of mine, easy, and he had great long fingers. And he would look after children. He would look after anyone that needed surgery. If you needed an appendix, he would take out your appendix. As a matter of fact, he used to say there wasn't too much joking around the operating room, but he used to make the comment, I can remember him doing one operation and taking out an appendix, and his incision for an appendix was maybe about that long, okay? And he would take those long fingers and he would go, there you are, you little devil. Okay, and he would proceed to cut it off, and away we go. But as far as being the CO of a surgical unit, he was fantastic. And we didn't have a private's mess, or a corporal's mess, or a sergeant's mess, or an officer's mess. We all drank together. Like you see on television, MASH, we had a club, okay? And once in a while, he would come in and sit down with the boys, and he'd have a drink just along with, and sometimes if he got drunk, or we got drunk, we'd call him by his first name, and then he would lean over and say, don't forget, I'm a colonel. But that was the way it was there. It was so relaxing. As a matter of fact, quite often when I watch MASH, I've watched every MASH, I've watched them 1,000 times over probably, because I associate with that. And there's some things that happened on television that there's no way that we did, okay? As a matter of fact, I have a copy of the Colonel's memoirs of his time in Korea right here in front of me. And he would do things, but he would never, ever joke in the operating room. But there was one series on television where they were pouring cement floor, And he had been down to the American MASH. He used to trade surgical procedures with the American MASH, the 8055. And, of course, they would come down and visit with him also, because, like I said, he was a top surgeon. There was no question about it. And so the Americans would come down too. And one time, I can remember one time they said, "Your operating room has got a sand floor?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "What do you expect, cement?" And the American surgeon says, "Well, we have a cement floor." He says, "Well, that's nice." He says, "You're Americans, you know." I don't know whether it was 1 day, 2 days, or 5 days later. Along came the cement trucks from the American forces. And they put a cement floor in the operating room, and they put a cement floor in the hospital where we worked, where the patients were. Because our infection rate in Korea was very, very high, even after surgery. I know that as a medic working at the FES, I used to give penicillin shots 3 times a day. Okay? Today it's one shot. But back then, it was 3 times a day. And if you've got 25 patients, they've all got to have a shot. They used to say, "Who's giving the needles today?" "Oh, Joe Smith." "Oh, Jesus, we're in trouble." "Oh, I think Osborne's on today." "Oh, great." They'd turn over their buttocks and be waiting for me. I had a technique that just, and they just did it, So I was pretty proud of that. As a matter of fact, when I took my training in Charlie Park in Toronto, the nurse said, she said, "You're pretty good at that," she said. So I guess it just followed me along. And through my medical career, I used to give shots. So needle parade was nothing for us to do a needle parade when I was a medic, evening back in Canada. And we'd do 500-600 people a day, So
did your infection rate go down after the concrete floor?
I can't really remember whether it did or not, because it was shortly after the concrete floor got put in. I think I came back to Canada, so I couldn't answer that question. Well, by the way, I can show you pictures here, but we had no nurses. Nurses were not, the closest nurse we had in Korea was in Seoul. They weren't allowed up into Uijeonbu, which was approximately 20 miles from the front line. And they used to come up and visit, okay? They would come from Japan, not from Seoul. The nurses used to come from Korea, Japan, over to us, and they would visit. And they would be there for 24 hours, okay? Well, if you're in Korea for 24 hours, you got the medal for being in Korea. And that was their purpose. And Colonel Darby, I remember one matron coming over, and as a matter of fact, she was going to climb my frame that particular day, because I was about ready to give penicillin, and I had a 10 cc syringe. And she said, "What are you doing with that?" I said, "I'm going to go and give the penicillin." "Not with that," she said. "You're going to get a smaller syringe." I said, "Ma'am, I don't have a smaller syringe." "Well, you go find one." So, of course, Colonel Darby heard this conversation. He wasn't operating that day. He was probably looking after a patient or something. He came in, he said, "What seems to be the problem?" He said, "Well, the private here, he's going to go out and give 10 cc penicillin with a 10 cc syringe?" He says, "Yeah, so?" Well, she says, "Can't he use a smaller syringe?" He said, "If you can get me one," he said, "we'll gladly use it." So that was the end of that conversation. He particularly didn't want nurses in his operating room or around him. He had a staff that he could rely on Sergeant Roper, or Soper, not Roper, was the best OR sergeant. He knew everything about the operating room. He was an operating room nurse. He'd be, under the conditions he worked, he would beat any operating room surgical team here in Canada right now, because he just knew everything. Of course, he did take a course for it. I mean, he just didn't walk in and start doing the job. He took a course on it, but he was good. As a matter of fact, as I think I've mentioned in my story, that we used to go out once in a while and tie one on. Well, I remember one particular day, including the commanding officer, we tied one on. And we used to go into the operating room after we tied one on the next morning and grab the oxygen. And if you take a good few whiffs of oxygen, it kind of lightens the head and you kind of sober up a little quicker. And he turned to switch the tanks on us, and we ended up with laughing gas. Well, we're on the floor in the operating room. Ross Myers, myself, Cyril DeValta, Kelly Braden. Oh, I can't remember all the guys, but there was quite a crew of us, and we'd sucked on this laughing gas. Of course, we're sitting on the operating room floor laughing our full heads off. Of course, the CO comes in and he says, "And just what in the hell is going on here?" And of course, Sergeant Roper explained. And he said, "They deserve it," he said, "but I'll take the oxygen." So that was the end of that, you know. But that was a comical time, you know. Jesus, I always remember that one. It was unreal. And it's too bad some of my buddies are passed away, because they can back up everything I'm telling you, you know.
So, John, I'm interested in the other roles that you did, and you talked about, you know, giving needles, and what are some of the other things that you would do maybe on a typical day, or are there bandaging?
Well, you take patients down to the X-ray department. We had an X-ray department. It wasn't anything fantastic, but sometimes the colonel would say, "I'd like to have this patient X-rayed," so we'd take him down. We didn't worry about paperwork in those days. We just took them down, X-rayed them, brought them back, and he would have the radiologist look at the X-ray or whatever, for whatever reason. And we would put people into ambulances to send them to Seoul. We also had what they called an MIR, which is medical inspection room, for daily treatments, not people who got wounded, people who were sick. They may have had the flu, they may have a cold, they don't feel well, they may have cut their finger on something or other, so we would look after them. It was like a day clinic, okay? And unfortunately, the biggest problem we had in that Korean War was veterinary disease. So we had to give them penicillin for that. And of course, we, as medics, we used to give them a lecture, you know, this is not the thing to do, blah, 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 and yeah, okay. And I remember one American soldier, and he came in, and he said, "I understand you guys don't report VD." We said, "No, we don't." He said, "Well, in the American Army, if you get VD, you end up in prison." So we said, "Oh." He says, "Is there any way you can help me out?" I said, "Well, first of all, we have to have the lab technician confirm that you have VD. Once we find that out, we can help you out." So in this particular case, we helped the guy out. And I was the one that gave him the shot of penicillin. And he said, "Geez, is there anything I can do for you?" "Anything, just name it." I said, "Yeah, you see that pistol you're wearing?" "Yeah?" He said, "I'd sure like to have one like that." "It's yours," just like that. So now I've got a 45, a chrome-handled pistol. Oh, it's beautiful. I forget how long it was, but lo and behold, doesn't he come back again? I said, I guess you didn't learn the lesson. No, he said, what's it going to cost me this time? I said, a pistol like the one I got. So for a while, they used to call me Two-Gun Pete, because I had two pistols. And the only thing I ever shot with them was tin cans. So I kept them, and I was bringing them home when heading back to Canada. But anyway, that's getting ahead of my story, I guess, a little bit. But basically, we looked after just about any medical problem that ever came in front of us. Either Colonel Darby would have to operate or give a diagnosis or whatever. And we just did our best, just like you see on television, except there was no jokes other than the one he's got written here. But I think I should tell you about, although I suppose I could tell you about it on camera, but the Colonel and his driver, I don't know whether you've ever heard of I can't remember his name right off the bat. He was the Colonel's driver anyway, and he's a famous painter for the Korean War. And you have...
Zuber.
Thank you, Ted Zuber. I couldn't think of his name. Ted Zuber, okay? And Ted Zuber was the Colonel's driver also. That's how I got to know Ted. Anyway, he took the Colonel and the anesthesiast, without looking in the book, I can't remember his name either, but anyway, he took 3 officers down to 8055 American MASH. And I guess they had a party while they were there. And on the way back, the anesthesiast, it was around Halloween time. So he stole one of the lanterns at the American MASH. They had lanterns out there. And lo and behold, on the way back, the Jeep caught on fire. So, of course, and they have to, when you're in Korea, you can't go very far, but you have to go through a checkpoint, okay? Well, the first checkpoint, they never even stopped. They just kept on barreling because the Jeep's on fire. So after they got past the first point, they stopped and tried to put the fire out. And I guess it was successful in some way, but it was really, really on fire. And Ted Zuber, as I can show you, now, right here. I'll just show you that just for the camera. There's Ted Zuber's cartoon of the Jeep being on fire, okay? Because Ted was pretty good at doing, rough sketches all the time. He was always doing something. So it was quite the scene, apparently, according to Ted. We didn't know about it until after it happened, but Ted drew a sketch of it, the whole bit. But I keep on referring to the Colonel because there was no question about it. He was a man of men. He was not a soldier. He was a surgeon, and if he got into trouble, he just let it go. He didn't, So,
was he the only doctor in the unit?
Pardon?
Was he the only doctor
Oh, no.
in the unit?
No, there was other, I can't remember all the doc. He had himself and 3 other surgeons with him. It's named in his memoirs here, but I can't remember them all now.
Did other medical units have nurses? Was that just his preference not to have nurses?
He had no nurses. There was no nurses in Korea, except for there was 2 in Seoul. All the rest of the nurses were in Curry, Japan. Now, I'm not saying that the nurses didn't come to Korea after the armistice was signed. That's a possibility, because they probably at that time, I think I've even said in the phone interview I had with you, if they'd have known that the ceasefire was going to be signed in July, I wouldn't have come home in May. They would have kept me, I know that, because they needed every medic they could get their hands on, because they were trading prisoners by the hundreds at that time when the ceasefire was signed. Both ways, it was prisoners going both ways, and they were being evacuated by ambulance, helicopter, you name it. So, like I said, they would have probably kept me over there. So.
What about the American units? Did they have nurses?
Yes, and the Norwegian MASH had nurses, but Canada didn't. I don't know why they didn't. The only thing I can say is I don't really think Colonel Darby wanted them. He had such a good team working with him that he wouldn't have traded any of us, right down to the last private, which at that time I was. You know, he wouldn't trade any of us. He'd say, "Oh, you leave him alone. He's great at what he does," and that was it. That was his attitude. He loved his team. So.
John, I was wondering about battle exhaustion, if you ever saw any, and how did they treat it, or do you recall?
I wouldn't say battle exhaustion, but we had quite a few psychiatric people. We had a psychiatrist on staff at the FDS, and he used to treat them. As a matter of fact, he used to use hypnotism quite a bit. And he would try to bring them, like people who got shell shocked and stuff like that, he would try to bring them out of it. And he was pretty good at it. I remember one guy, he fooled that psychiatrist to no end. He had a dog. But he didn't have a dog, okay? But he would put a water pail out there for the dog. He would put food out for the dog. He had a leash for a dog. I suppose in a roundabout way he was like Corporal Klinger on television, okay? He did everything to try and get out of the Army. And eventually he made it. We took him down to Seoul. And I remember taking him up to the aircraft, and he turned around and he kicked the dog. He says, "I don't need you no more." Walked on the plane. So that was just one case that most of the cases were, serious cases, but that was one I do remember. But that was just the way it was, I guess. There was Klingers in the armed forces.
Do you recall treating either enemy soldiers or civilians, or?
I only really seen, and of course I have to backtrack there, I only ever really seen one enemy soldier. And that was due to the fact that there was a rumor going around that some Mongolian soldiers were involved with the Chinese. So they sent out word that they were to try and capture a Mongolian soldier on the Chinese side. And the Van Doos were given that job. And the Van Doos did go out on patrol, and they did capture one. Now, believe it or not, these guys were 6 feet tall. They were huge. For some unknown reason, why people I see from Mongolians, they're little short people, most of them. But this guy was really, really tall. As a matter of fact, when they put him on the stretcher, wherever they captured him from, they had to put a belt across the top of the stretcher so his head would rest on the belt. Okay? And the same thing at the bottom. They used a sling and tied it around the bottom of so his feet would rest on it because he was oversized. And that was back in the field ambulance, and they brought him down, of course, they had him strapped to that stretcher too. And he was wounded. They had shot him. And of course, Major Evans was the doctor at the time, came in to examine this particular prisoner. And the prisoner spit right in the Major's face. And the Van Du gave him the butt end of a rifle and broke his jaw. Right there in the treatment room. And the Major, of course, tried to stop it, but it was too late. The Van Du, that's my prisoner, and he's going to Seoul, and they were escorting him all the way to Seoul. Okay. So, but basically, that was the only real prisoner I ever saw. You know, I've seen lots of South Korean soldiers, but as far as the enemy went, no, he was the only one I ever saw.
So would you have treated like South Korean soldiers or the porters? They talk about the...
if South Korean soldiers got wounded, oh yeah, we looked after them. Basically, they were looked after by their own. But the occasional one did come through, and we knew they were South Korean because of their uniform, okay? But because we knew what the North Korean uniform looked like, so it was no big deal. But the biggest problem, and I didn't know this until after I came back from Korea, that an awful lot of the North Koreans were evacuating down the road, and they were with the civilians. So we never, when they were dressed in civilian clothes, you couldn't tell whether they were North Korean or South Korean. And there was hundreds and hundreds. When we first got to Korea, and at one point we were in trucks going to our unit, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people, men, women, and children, walking down the road. And you know where they're heading for? Busan, 300 miles away. That was the only place they didn't want to stop in Seoul, because Seoul was just about wiped out. I've got pictures at home. We had one bridge over the river. That was it. And I would say in the city of Seoul, there was probably no more than 25 buildings standing that were livable. There were still buildings standing that were all bombed, but people were still using them. But on the average, there was about 25 buildings that were livable. Okay, the rest were just, and like I said, one bridge. Well, I've been back to Korea 5 times. Okay? And the last count, when I was back there, they had 29 bridges. And they have at that time, they had 10 million people living in Seoul. So it gives you, they're very, very, very prosperous today. And when a Canadian soldier goes back to Korea, they treat you like God. We are just it. For some unknown reason. I don't know why. Well, I suppose I do know why, because we used to feed, at the FDS, we used to feed the kids. After we'd eaten, if there was any food left over, the kids that hung around the camp would get fed. And the colonel, like I said, being the gentleman he was, he made sure these little kids got fed. So, and I guess some of them ended up in orphanages or whatever, but,
So, John, you must have been under quite a bit of stress, really, when you're describing seeing all these wounded soldiers and dying soldiers. So what did you do for kind of entertainment? Did you ever have any groups come through, or like what types of things did you guys do to release, or did they try to entertain you and help you guys out with any morale or anything like that?
No, not really. We just handled whatever came through. As a matter of fact, my good friend George Stagg, he said to me, "I don't know, John, how you can be so callous. You see these people coming in with shot up or legs blown off." And he said, "It just doesn't seem to bother you." And I said, "Well, George, I've been through all this." He says, "How can you be through all this?" He says, you've only been in the Army the same length of time as I have. I said, well, George, I lived in England during the war, and I seen people's houses blown up. I seen people get killed. As a matter of fact, I lost 5 good friends during the war in England, and we were bummed out of our home 5 times. So casualties didn't bother me when I was, because I'd already seen it. So it just, I guess what they used the word, I was callous. Didn't fizz on me. If I had to do something, I did it. I just went and took care of it. So.
Could you comment on your birthdays? Did you recall any events? Because you're underage. So do you remember celebrating?
I was celebrating my birthday, but nobody really knew how old I was because I didn't tell anybody. What really surprised me was, I guess after the newspapers started saying Canadian soldiers are being killed in Korea and that, parents were starting to write the Veterans Affairs saying, you know, I think my son's over there, and I think he's underage, you better check him out. So there was people who were underage who were returned back to Canada and released from the Canadian Armed Forces. But like I said, my parents said, if that's what you want to do, go for it. And they never did write a letter, so I stayed there. And over my military career, I just automatically, I always said I was born in 1932. But in actual fact, I was born in 1934. Okay? So I did lie about my age. Okay? But they didn't know that. And at that time, they never asked for a birth certificate or anything. Okay? They just wanted soldiers for the Korean War. So it was, I guess, because some of the stories I've read, there was even younger people than me during the Second World War. So it was just one of those things. But no, it just didn't fizz on me when I saw the casualties, whether they were dead people or people with legs blown off or arms blown off or wounded. I just went ahead and treated them, or in the case of someone who's been killed, put them in a body bag and just wait for them to be put onto the truck, and that was it.